Hello, I'm Justin Ruiz, the Director of IR Activation at Cision, and I want to welcome everyone to our discussion on how ESG is impacting your story and overall narrative with Chris Stent of Jones Lang LaSalle. At Cision, we believe that environmental, social, and governance criteria are essential factors to consider when building and growing a successful business. We also understand that ESG is a critical consideration for our IR clients and their investors. That's why we're excited here to have the discussion today about the importance of incorporating ESG into your brand story. Today, we're joined by Chris Stent, Executive Managing Director of Investor Relations and Corporate Finance at JLL. Chris, if you'd like to give us a little bit of background information on yourself, that'd be great, and then we can just jump right in.
Justin, thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here and speak with you. I've been at JLL for a little less than two years, and I oversee our investor relations function as well as corporate finance activities, including M&A. Prior to JLL, I was the IRO at McDonald's Corporation for many years, and have a background in investment banking and brand management, which I did following business school. So the blend between marketing and finances has been helpful to me in the investor relations role.
Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. And before we jump into our conversation, I wanted to read a little quote regarding ESG just to frame the conversation we're about to have. In 2020, we completed our goal of having 100% of our active and advisory portfolios ESG integrated. We intensified our investment stewardship focus on sustainability, and we introduced nearly 100 new sustainable funds, helping to increase access and provide investors with greater choice. Now, that was provided by Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock. Like I mentioned, Chris, I wanted to frame the conversation here before we jump into some of the line of questioning, just to give some perspective to our listeners and our viewers. Let's just jump right into this. How can you incorporate ESG messaging into your company's specific growth initiatives? Is it harder for a larger, more established company to implement ESG as a growth opportunity?
At JLL, we have a very clearly articulated purpose. We want to shape the future of real estate for a better world. And so for us, what we want to do, our purpose, ties in extremely well when we think about things in terms of the overall ESG framework. And we have a unique opportunity to affect change. But JLL has really taken a leadership role, not only in creating commitments and targets out there, and we have kind of a track record of exceeding them, but also providing expertise to our clients in helping them both articulate their goals regarding ESG, as well as developing a game plan for how they're going to accomplish those goals. As it relates to JLL and our own growth initiatives, again, it kind of starts with the purpose. We want to shape the future of real estate for a better world. And as we think about what's going to drive growth under that, certainly sustainability from a commercialization standpoint is there, but we kind of have that North Star about doing not only what's good for the company, but what's good for the environment, what's good for the community, and all the other stakeholders there. And that is the lens through which we think about our growth ambitions. And I think having that clear purpose has been very helpful as we develop annual operating budgets and plans to execute against that.
Do you find it difficult developing those budgets? Is it something that is a newer factor when thinking about operating a company?
I think any executive at any enterprise, business, nonprofit, educational, health system, et cetera, you're ultimately in the business of resource allocation. You're allocating your time, your capital, and your people. And the way we think about resource allocation is really, where are we going to have the maximum impact and generate the highest, most efficient returns. But it is with a longer term view. And I think that's one of the elements of ESG, is hopefully it frees an organization to think outside of the quarterly cycle and even the annual cycle, but to think about some longer term commitments. And we have a number of commitments that are 2030, 2040. So I do think that one of the advantages of incorporating ESG into the mindset and the framework is the ability to think longer term. And then you need to plot how you're going to get from where you are now, which a lot of companies are really at the ambition phase, to the execution phase, and then hopefully a point where they're hitting some of those targets.
Absolutely. Which aspects of ESG make strategic sense for a company's growth?
I think that there's so many aspects when you think about the workforce and the advantage of a diverse workforce. And diversity and inclusion is obviously very front and center now. But when we think about climate risk and the impact on the environment and what companies can do there, I think that when you really start piecing it out and all the different elements across ESG, and even from a governance standpoint, I think that those, when you look at what you're trying to achieve across all those different levers, and again, take a longer term mindset and then allocate your resources accordingly to whatever opportunities you see as a company, I think it becomes much clearer. And again, it's more than just a weekly or monthly or quarterly cadence. It's a much longer term perspective. And we found that to be very helpful, kind of thinking longer term and then bringing it back to a shorter term focus and frame.
It certainly helps frame the future of the company in a very, very interesting way. Getting to more of the investment side, ESG-focused funds have become more popular within the last year. So how can your ESG message stand out amongst your competitors?
Justin, I think if we were to be talking 7 or 8 years ago, ESG and those types of issues would have been a like to have, and it probably would have been tailored more towards non-US investors. What's happened over the past 4 to 5 years is US investors have adopted it as not only a mindset, but as one of their investment criteria. And we've seen exponential growth in importance over the past 12 to 24 months. And certainly the pandemic accelerated adoption of the importance and prominence of ESG among the investment merits as investors consider investments. So it's increasingly important to investors, pretty much all investors. There are ESG focused funds, but you raised a terrific quote early in the session by Larry Fink of BlackRock. BlackRock is one of the largest money managers in the world. BlackRock typically owns somewhere between 8 and 13% of every public business. And when you have that big of an investor detailing very specific expectations for how companies are going to think about ESG, I think what it does is it creates ground rules just for playing the game. And I think a lot of other investors have followed in that path.
It's ground rules is a great way of putting it, and they're good ground rules. It's a step in the right direction. With an increase in ESG messaging, How do you see this impacting a company's value?
I think that increasingly investors are looking beyond just financial results, short-term financial results, and thinking about the cost of those financial results. And you certainly see it with companies that have a disproportionate impact on the environment and some of the discounts that those companies now trade at from a valuation standpoint. And conversely, you see businesses that have a much less significant impact on the environment trading at lofty valuations. And then you have everything else in between. But I think what it speaks to is the evolving mindset of investors to consider not just financial returns, but what the impact is of an enterprise on not only the environment, but the community. And this idea that, being a good corporate citizen is not only good, being a good neighbor, but it's ultimately in a business enterprise's long-term interest. And I think that, that totalitarian view of, thinking about things just beyond the P&L and the balance sheet and the cash flow statement is something that the world is increasingly embracing. I think Europe was probably much more evolved in terms of how they were thinking about things. They tend to take a longer term view than the average US investor, but I think that has come across the Atlantic, and a lot of US investors are thinking much longer term and in a more complete manner.
Yeah, it begs the question if you think this will create a sea change in the mindset of investors for a longer term thought process when it comes to investing.
I think where we are now is you have the firms, the BlackRocks of the world, saying ESG is really, really important. Companies need to focus on it, and they need to make meaningful change in these areas. But then you have the portfolio managers who at the end of the day are trying to deliver alpha. And they're trying to deliver alpha in a relatively short time frame, quarterly, annually, et cetera. So we're in the process of in firm-wide objectives being set at the top and communicated versus the portfolio managers who were tasked with the very challenging objective of beating the market. And I think that that's kind of where we are now. We're evolving, and we're much further than we were even 4 or 5 years ago, much less 8 to 10 years ago. But we still are very much on the journey and have not yet arrived.
The challenge is there, but I expect JLL will meet the challenge, as will many other companies. But Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. Like I mentioned, ESG is definitely here to stay, and we will have more conversations like this in the future. Of course, while Cision can help with your IR communication needs, from financial releases to IR rooms, we also now offer several ESG packages as part of our Cision Insights product to help organizations chart their ESG coverage, view how it compares with competitors, and stay ahead of the markets. If you'd like to learn more, feel free to visit our virtual booth, click the link that's provided, or just attend more sessions like today. Thank you so much again, and hopefully we'll have another conversation like this soon.
Thank you for having me, Justin.